The Galactic Council of 17 Civilizations had a rule, a very simple, very old, very sacred rule. Do not touch the humans. Do not poke them. Do not observe them too closely. Do not, under any circumstances, let them notice you. And yet, here we were, poking them, quite literally. My name is Vorik, 9, Senior Observation Analyst of the Ket Dominion, and I want to be very clear about something before this record goes into the archives. This disaster was not my idea. I filed 3 formal objections. 3. They are all there, stamped and logged, and completely ignored by Commander Delax, who believed, with a confidence that I can only describe as catastrophically misplaced, that one small gravitational nudge near the edge of the Milky Way would go entirely unnoticed by the species in question. Commander Delax has never met a human. I have. Well, I had, briefly, from a very safe distance, through a quantum-shielded surveillance lens. And even then, one of them looked up at the sky at exactly the wrong moment and said, out loud, to no one in particular, that star's moving weird. They noticed. They always notice. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how this started. Let me tell you about the morning the humans nearly broke our entire understanding of physics. Not because they are powerful and not because they are ancient, but because they are absolutely, relentlessly, terrifyingly stubborn. It was the 4th rotation of cycle 88 when our long-range scanner first picked up the anomaly. The Vektor corridor, a narrow band of space approximately 11,000 light-years from the human home system, had developed what our scientists called a temporal fold, a rare natural phenomenon. Space-time compressed and bent, creating a region where time moved at approximately 1/8 its normal rate. Ships passing through would experience a few minutes of travel. Outside, nearly a full standard year would pass. Beautiful, in a terrifying sort of way. The problem? It sat directly across the only navigable path between our eastern trade routes and the rest of the civilized galaxy. The bigger problem? It sat directly between humanity and one of their deep space telescope arrays. Delax looked at the fold. He looked at the telescope. He said, and I quote, "We simply need to nudge it 6 degrees off the ecliptic plane. Easy." I said, "Sir, the humans will detect the gravitational displacement." He said, "The humans are still arguing about whether their own moon is geologically active. They will not notice a 6-degree nudge in a temporal fold 11,000 light-years away. Reader, they notice in 4 days. The first signal we intercepted was from a human communications relay station, a battered, solar-powered little thing drifting near the edge of the system. The message was sent to a facility on their 3rd planet, to a researcher named Tomek Orov at something called the International Space Monitoring Institute. The message read, and I am translating as accurately as I can, "Hey, did we bump the Vektor array? Because it's seeing something extremely strange at coordinates J17, and I need to know if this is a calibration error before I lose my mind." That was day 1. By day 4, Tomek Orov had published a preliminary paper titled Anomalous Gravitational Signature and Spatial Displacement Event in the Mid-Galactic Band, a case for non-natural origin. The words non-natural origin sent a very specific kind of chill across our observation deck. The kind that starts at the base of your neck and ends somewhere around your 3rd spine node. Delax read the paper. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "They cannot possibly have a resolution to determine non-natural origin from 11,000 light-years." I pulled up their data. Their resolution was, in fact, excellent, genuinely impressive. I did not say this out loud because I value my posting. What happened next was the part that no one, not me, not Delax, not the entire Galactic Council of 17 Civilizations, had anticipated. Because a reasonable species, upon detecting a gravitational anomaly of unknown origin at 11,000 light-years, would do one of 2 things. They would file a report, or they would convene a committee, a long, slow, boring committee that would eventually produce a recommendation that would eventually be considered by a panel that would eventually, perhaps in a generation or 2, suggest a course of action. Humans did neither of these things. Within 6 days of Tomek Orov's paper going public, a human named Suki Dravik at a facility called the Coordinated Deep Space Agency had already drafted a response mission proposal. Not a study, not a probe, a crude mission. A crewed mission to fly to the edge of the anomaly, take readings from close range, and, in Suki Dravik's own words, figure out what the hell is going on out there. I read that proposal 3 times. Then I walked into Commander Delix's office, and I placed it on his desk, and I said, very calmly, "Sir, they are coming here." Delax looked at the proposal. He looked at me. He looked at the proposal again. He said, "They do not have the propulsion capacity to reach the Veth corridor." I said, "They did not have propulsion capacity last year, sir. They have been working on something new." The silence that followed was the loudest silence I have experienced in 42 years of service. Because the thing about humans, the thing that every species in the Council knows, and that every species in the Council politely avoids discussing in formal meetings, is that they innovate under pressure the way other species breathe. Automatically, relentlessly, without being entirely sure why they're doing it. Point a human at an impossible problem, and they will not rest. They will not sleep properly. They will drink enormous quantities of a bitter liquid they call coffee. They will argue loudly with their colleagues. They will cover every surface in equations, and they will eventually find a way. And someone had pointed them at our anomaly. The Council emergency session was called on day 8. 43 representatives from 17 civilizations, all projecting into a secure meeting space, all looking at the same translated document, the mission proposal, fully funded, crew selected, launch window set. 11 months from now, the representative from the Sora Collective, a very old, very calm individual named Priel, looked at the document for a long time. Then she looked at all of us and said, "How long until they arrive at the fold?" Our logistics officer ran the numbers. At projected velocity, assuming successful propulsion trials, approximately 14 months. Priel nodded slowly. "And what do we do when they get there?" No one had an answer, because here was the fundamental problem that no one in the room wanted to say out loud. We could not move the fold again. We had already moved it once, and they had noticed immediately. Moving it a second time, while a human mission was already en route, would be like waving a flag at them, a very large flag, that said, "Hello, someone is here, and they are messing with your physics." We were, to use a human expression I had recently learned from monitoring their communications, completely cooked. The meeting ended without a resolution. It ended with Commander Delax looking slightly pale, with Priel looking serene in a way that suggested she had already accepted a very difficult outcome, and with me sitting very still, reading the mission crew list that had been attached to the proposal. 6 humans, all of them specialists, a physicist, a propulsion engineer, a xenobiologist, a communications expert, a structural analyst, and the mission commander. Her name was Adra Bolik. I looked up her record. 17 years in deep space operations. The only human to have successfully navigated a collapsed jump corridor while her navigation system was offline. A woman who, according to her own after-action report, had fixed a failing reactor coupling with a piece of her boot in 17 minutes of free time. I read that report. Then I looked at Commander Delax, who was still staring at the fold coordinates on the holographic display, and I said, very quietly, "Sir, I think we may need a plan B." He did not respond. Somewhere 11,000 light years away, in a building full of equations and empty coffee cups, Adra Bolik was probably already packing. 11 months is a very long time when you are waiting for something terrible to happen. It is also, apparently, not nearly long enough for the Galactic Council of 17 civilizations to agree on a single course of action. We held 9 sessions. 9. We produced 4 competing proposals, 2 subcommittee reports, 1 strongly worded resolution that nobody signed, and unanimous agreement to table everything until the next session. The Sora Collective's representative, Priel, attended every single meeting with the expression of someone who had already read the ending of a book and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. I spent those 11 months doing what I do best. Watching, listening, translating. The human mission, officially designated the Veth Deep Survey, had its own public communications channel, the kind their civilians could follow. Updates, photographs, crew interviews. It was, I will admit, completely fascinating, in a way that watching someone walk confidently toward a cliff edge is fascinating. You cannot look away. You are horrified. You are also, against your better judgment, a little bit impressed. Adra Bolick gave exactly one interview before departure. The interviewer asked her what she expected to find. She looked directly at the camera, without hesitation, without performance, and said, "I don't know." That's the point. 3 words. That is the point. I transcribed them into our mission file, and then I sat quietly for a moment, because that sentence, those 3 words, contain more intellectual honesty than the entirety of our 9 council sessions combined. The launch went perfectly. Of course it did. Their new propulsion system, which their engineers had apparently developed in 9 months from a theoretical framework to a functioning drive, pushed the ship to a velocity that revised every projection our logistics team had made. They were not arriving in 14 months. They were arriving in 9. Delax went very quiet when we updated the timeline, the kind of quiet that fills a room. Then he said, "We need to establish a perimeter." I said, "Sir, a perimeter will be visible to their instruments the moment they enter the outer corridor." He said, "Then we need be very far back." I said, "Sir, there is no distance that is far enough." He looked at me. I looked at him. We had a very honest moment of mutual understanding that neither of us acknowledged out loud. The ship was called the Vektor. Clean name, direct, very human. It crossed the outer boundary of the Veth corridor on a Tuesday, which is a human time unit I have always found charming in its specificity. And within 40 minutes of crossing that boundary, their sensors had already mapped 3 of our observation buoys. 3. We had placed them at what our engineers assured us were undetectable distances. Their physicist, a compact, relentlessly focused woman named Yara Finch, apparently spent the first hour in the corridor staring at the sensor readings with the kind of concentration that precedes either a breakthrough or a headache. Based on the crew communications we intercepted, it was both. Her message to mission control on the home planet read, "We are seeing structured emissions at regular intervals on a frequency band that does not match any natural source cataloged in our database." Repeating pattern. Deliberate spacing. Either someone built these, or the universe has developed a very strange sense of humor. The response from mission control took 22 minutes to arrive, given the distance. It read, "Can you confirm?" Yara Finch's response took approximately 4 seconds. It read, "Yes." At this point, Commander Delax made a decision. I will give him credit for this, because it was the first genuinely correct decision he had made since this entire situation began. He called an emergency council session. He looked at every representative in that room, and he said, "We should talk to them." The silence was substantial. The representative from among hierarchy, a tall, angular individual named Koss, said, "We are not prepared for contact protocols. The humans have not been assessed for readiness." I said, because no one else was going to say it, "With respect, Koss, they already know we are here. Readiness assessment is no longer a variable we control." Koss looked at me. "You are an analyst, Vorik, 9, not a policy voice." I said, "I am an analyst who has spent 11 months listening to these people. And what I can tell you is that Adra Bolick is currently sitting in that ship, looking at our buoys and deciding what to do next. We can choose to be the ones who speak first, or we can wait and let her decide the terms of this conversation." The room was very quiet. Priel, who had not spoken in the last 3 sessions, said simply, "He is right. It passed. Barely. 11 votes to 6. With the Mun hierarchy abstaining in a way that communicated considerable displeasure. Our communications team spent 4 hours preparing a signal, a clean mathematical greeting, frequency modulated, designed to be clearly artificial and clearly non-threatening. We sent it. The response came back in 6 minutes. Not a mathematical pattern, not a formal reply. Adra Bolick's voice, unfiltered, translated by our systems in real time, calm and precise, and carrying particular weight of someone who has just had a very large theory confirmed. "This is Commander Adra Bolick of the Deep Survey Vessel Vektor. We receive your signal. We would like to talk." The council chamber erupted. 17 species of diplomatic panic, all happening simultaneously, all overlapping in a way that was genuinely impressive to witness. Koss was talking about protocols. 3 other representatives were talking about security. Someone was demanding a full recess. Adra Bullock was waiting. I looked at Delax. He looked at me. Then, in a move that I will record here as the second correct decision of his career, he said, "Vorik, 9. You have been studying them longest." You respond. I want to be clear. I was not prepared for this. I had no diplomatic training, no contact protocol certification, nothing except 11 months of transcripts and a very thorough understanding of how these people think, which is, perhaps, exactly what was needed. I opened the channel. I said, in the closest approximation of their language our translation matrix could produce, "Commander Bullock, we hear you. We apologize for the disruption to your observation data." Another 6 minutes of light speed delay. Then her voice again, and this time there was something in it. Something I can only describe as the sound of a person trying very hard not to laugh. "You moved our fold." I said, "Yes, we did. That was a mistake." "Why did you move it?" "It was blocking our trade routes." A pause. Then, very evenly, "You have trade routes." "Quite a few, yes." Another pause. Longer this time. Then, "How many of you are out here?" I looked around the council chamber at 43 representatives from 17 civilizations, all staring at me, all holding their breath. I said, "Enough that this conversation has a very large audience." When her response came back, there was a sound in the background that our audio analysis confirmed was laughter, multiple voices, her crew listening, and Adra Bullock, mission commander, 17-year veteran, fixer reactors with boot components, said, "Well then, I suppose we should make a good impression." What followed was 4 hours of the most careful, most tense, most unexpectedly civil first contact exchange in the recorded history of the galaxy. She asked questions that were sharp and specific, and showed a mind that missed nothing. We answered as honestly as the council would allow, which was more honestly than they were comfortable with. Because every time I gave a vague answer, she asked a follow-up question that made the vagueness completely transparent. Yara Finch, her physicist, sent a separate technical channel request midway through the session. Her message said, "I have 17 questions about the temporal fold mechanics, and I would like to speak to whoever built the buoys." I forwarded it to our engineering division. Our chief engineer, a researcher named Bedu, 11, who had not spoken to a non-Keth individual in 30 years, responded within minutes. They were still talking 8 hours later. The council held an emergency session the next day. The mood was different, quieter, more honest. Kas, who had been the most resistant, sat in silence for a long time and then said, "They are not what we expected." I said, "No, they rarely are." Priel said, "What do they want?" I said, "They want to know their neighbors." Another silence. Then Priel looked around the room, at all 17 civilizations, at all the centuries of careful hiding, of quiet avoidance, of elaborate systems designed to keep the humans from noticing, and she said, "We should have introduced ourselves a long time ago." No one disagreed. The formal contact agreement was signed 3 weeks later, relayed across the light speed gap between the Vektor and the Council in a series of clean, verified transmissions. It was not a treaty of alliance. It was not a trade agreement. It was simpler than that. It was a document that said, in the careful language of 17 civilizations and one human mission commander, "We are here. You are here. Let us not pretend otherwise." Adra Bullock signed it with her full name, and then added, beneath her signature, in her own handwriting, scanned and transmitted, "Next time, just ask us to move the telescope." The council had no official response to that. Unofficially, I laughed for approximately 40 seconds, which is a very long time for a Keth analyst in a professional setting, and I did not apologize for it. I filed my final report on the Veth corridor incident on Cycle 89, Day 22. The conclusion section was, by council standards, unusually brief. It read, "The temporal fold has been stabilized in a neutral position acceptable to all parties. The humans are aware of our presence and have responded with greater composure and intelligence than our pre-contact models predicted. Recommend immediate revision of all pre-contact assessment frameworks. Current models significantly underestimate the species." Delax read the report. He did not edit the conclusion. The Vektor began its return journey 18 days later. Before departure, Adra Bolick sent one final message to our communications channel. It was not addressed to the council. It was addressed to me, specifically, because she had worked out through 17 layers of diplomatic communication that I was the one who had been on the other end of the line from the beginning. It said, Vorik 9, thank you for being honest. The others kept giving me answers that sounded like policies. Yours sounded like thoughts. There is a difference, and it matters. See you soon. We're already working on a faster drive. I read that message 4 times. Then I put in the archive under a new category that had not existed before this incident. I labeled it First Contact, Successful, and somewhere on the 3rd planet of a small yellow star, in a building that I've been watching for 11 months, Tomek Orov, the researcher who had started all of this by noticing a fold that should have been invisible, published a second paper. The title was, We Are Not Alone, and frankly, it is about time. He was right, on both counts.